especially having moved out here and seen the way that they've interviewed myself, for instance, as an example, um, it's very actually similar. So here in Dubai, as an example, they have actually transitioned into more of a Western sort of culture around design, and they understand that obviously they need to be very up to date with their trends in the way that people are working, but also in the same way that in the way that they're interviewing people. So, you know, I've actually, before I got out here, interviewed for 4 different companies, and you can see the one that was the most mature, which is the company I work for, had the most mature interview process. The other companies I interviewed for were less mature, and they were asking things like take-home tasks and working sessions without really following a guide. So it was a bit sort of, and what I'm trying to get to is the role was for a senior product designer, but they were asking for purely UI elements to be focused on. And if you are truly trying to onboard someone for a product design role, processes matter, as much as sort of the finished product. And that's what I sort of saw. So I feel like, going back to the original question of like, what's an ideal interview process? Ultimately, I would really want to see from the interviewee a real understanding of how important it is for like a full process around how you work, stakeholder management, these kind of things. Not so much looking in detail at how good or not so good my portfolio is when it comes down to finished work.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think we could do like a better job of, when it comes to like job adverts and applying for stuff, with actual job descriptions, like showing how weighted a role is towards certain areas? Because I feel like sometimes you can see product design job specs out there, right, and they all look exactly the same, but in hindsight, when you're interviewing and when you get into a company, it's completely different company to company.
100%, like it's exactly that. If it's a senior product design role, ultimately there is going to be a blend of both user experience and user interface design work that's going to be ongoing. But then don't then get into an interview process and then tell them that there's going to be a heavy amount of UI that's going to be focused on. Again, you see a lot of companies now, they have a very, very mature design system. So the UI element, for instance, as an example, is going to be quite minimal if you've got quite a mature design system. So if that is going to be the case, showcase that. Let them know that they're going to be working with a really good design system with a dedicated team who's going to be focused on that. So at least you can manage your own expectations. I mean, I don't know, Jess, what your experience is, but
probably quite similar. I think, sometimes there's a bit of an issue about being upfront with what the expectations for the role are, because obviously it's different in different size companies, as you said, different maturity levels. So for me personally, during an interview process, I of course feel like I'm interviewing you as well. I want to know if this is the right thing for me. So I think I've had a couple of situations where it's more so everything being directed at me, and I feel I much prefer the interview process when it's a bit more equally weighted and there's a bit of back and forth, and we can understand if we're going to work well together. It's a lot of focus on kind of showcasing your skills, your talent, but actually it needs to probably come down to a more human level and whether you'd fit in and whether they'd kind of fit with you.
No, definitely. And what are your thoughts on take-home tasks?
That's exactly my thought process.
Not for me.
Yeah, I literally think it's the laziest thing that anyone can do. I just feel like if you're truly trying to find the best candidate, you're not going to gauge anything about how they're going to work with teams and stakeholders through giving them a task that they can do. Either it is a live working session or something that they do in their own space and you come back and review it. You're not gonna understand how well they can work with people purely on their design skill set. It's just not gonna happen. You're literally off a failure.
there's always like, don't spend too long on it, just a couple of hours, and it's like, well, obviously I'm going to put my heart and soul into this if I want the job, and you end up spending like a week on it. But I've also done the live design tasks, and I must say, for my personality type, kind of being like performing in a way and kind of thinking on my feet, I'm much more reserved when it comes to those kind of things, and I like to think about things in my own time. So I'm also not a fan of live design tasks because I'll just be a nervous wreck.
No, that's fair enough. I think with live tasks, like it's so dependent on personalities as well. So
Yeah.
what would your like ideal alternative be to both? Like, do you think there's a way that we can also like educate companies that you don't have to necessarily do either of those? There are other ways to be able to assess capabilities.
I would say I much prefer kind of walking through some of my live design files. I found that can be a super good indicator as to how you work and just the level of detail you go into, your involvement in flows and visuals. And I also don't have to use all of my time to do this. It's already something that I've worked on.
Yeah, I feel like from my side, there's two ways you can approach it. I completely disagree with giving someone a completely empty file and tell them to start design from scratch, because that's never going to happen. But if you are trying to gauge whether or not somebody can maybe on the fly in a working session with senior stakeholders, make some amendments to designs, then at least give them a fully fledged set of designs, and then basically ask them questions on how you would find another solution for a certain sort of screen, certain component, etc. Because those things are real, and they might really want to find out what you're like working under pressure, which is completely fine. But at least then set them up in a real case scenario, because giving them a task and saying build that from scratch, it's never going to happen. I've actually had a horror experience where with a head of design, I started doing the design, and literally as I'm designing my small little design system so I can get onto the flow, literally he came into the Figma file and said, "Stop designing a design system, just work with flows." I'm going, but I need to set myself up. So again, managing expectations is super important, because clearly he didn't tell me what he was expecting to see from the start. So then I obviously didn't start doing a very good job. And literally at that point, I was like, even if they gave me the job, I literally was like, I'll decline. Because again, it's a work in ways. If you're not very clear in what you want in terms of an expectation, it's going to be very difficult to deliver what they actually want from you.
Like when it comes to interviewing, I know you touched on like how they actually follow processes is really important, how weighted the roles are going to be. What else do you really like to hear from an interviewer, or actually find out about a company that's like important to you?
I always like to hear around kind of the design process. I've worked in kind of a real variety of kind of very product led, very design led, and you always know what your preference is going into that. So just being very upfront about how things actually are is really helpful in kind of making a decision, because obviously everyone's willing to make compromises, but we just need to have all the information to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think for myself, one of the number one things that I've been looking at most recently is the level of autonomy around decision making at like a team level. If you're, especially as you sort of work your way up and you start to become a senior and sort of a head of or lead, these kind of things, if you're still at those levels and you don't hold weight in terms of decision making, it's quite demotivating in terms of the work that you're actually producing. So it's really important to understand what that looks like as well. And again, go back down to job descriptions, and then part of the interview process is really understanding, how many different people are going to be involved in that, because then at least you can then make a decision on what your day-to-day starts to look like. So it really is around that in terms of decision making, but then also to sort of dovetail off of what Jess just said, there is what the balance is between like developers and designers as well. I've worked in companies where it's very, engineer led in terms of decision making. So again, you're just setting yourself for understanding what kind of a designer you become within that company.
Definitely. And any red flags when interviewing? Like, do you ever hear anything you think, oh, that's not a good sign?
I've actually got one off the top of my head.
Oh
But,
God.
yeah, it's who's involved in decision making. Put it that way.
Okay. I think I can guess what you're saying there.
Yeah, the honesty comes down to that, right? If you're hearing that there's going to be senior people, senior stakeholders who are going to be making design decisions on a really minor level, what it starts to become is understanding who's involved on the day to day when it comes down to design. Because I feel like then that is a clear indicator there's a huge lack of trust. And if there's a lack of trust in terms of the people that you're hiring, then it's going to be quite a bottleneck sort of environment when it comes down to the design work that you're going to be producing, because you're ultimately hiring that person based upon their skill set and their experience. There's got to be a level of trust to go, you know what, we can go round and round in terms of discussions and conversations about what's right, what's wrong. But at the end of the day, the decision that's going to be made, you've hired that person for a reason. Have an element of trust. And if it does maybe backfire and it doesn't turn out to be the best decision in terms of design, then allow them to iterate off the back of it.
Yeah, I think just kind of going back to the interview process as well in relation to what you're saying, Sal, is the kind of mistrust you can almost feel when it's kind of like a 5-6 stage interview process. And that in itself is a red flag. I kind of know if you don't even trust the hiring team, it's probably not a fantastic working environment. And there's probably not a load of trust in the design as a function. That'll just put me off right away, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a great point actually around how many different steps you go through and stages. Again, I've had incidents where it's been just one interview and others where I've had like 6. And it's always been the ones where one or two, which has been worked out the best, to be honest with you. It doesn't have to be a loaded process, because I feel like you're not getting the best from both sides. The candidates ultimately like lingering around, waiting, preparing themselves, doing loads of preparation for 3-4 interviews, and it's sort of a weighted, long, lengthy experience for the employer side as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've seen the most success with interview processes that are like between 2-3 stages. So it's, you get it wrapped up within like a week, 2 weeks. It's just really streamlined. There's, as long as you know what you're looking for and you're asking the right questions, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get it wrapped up within that time.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there. Is that a lot of them who don't know what they're looking for, those are usually the companies who are lengthy in their process and not as transparent in sort of their description in terms of what the job's there to entail, really.
Yeah, for sure.
We've definitely seen it in the UK, Jess, that majority of companies are moving back to like that hybrid working model, so like 2-3 days a week in the office. What are your thoughts on it as designers? Do you feel like it's helpful, or do you still feel like you could do your job just as well remotely?
I would say I'm happy doing both. I definitely love doing in-person kind of workshopping and meetings. And then I love my heads down time, like no one disturb me in my own space. I feel like I get so much more done at home, but I still appreciate the kind of face-to-face time. I think the only thing for me is I like to be flexible with it, and I kind of want to be in charge of when I do come in somewhere and or when I don't. I'm not a fan of being dictated to kind of what days and when. I just appreciate flexibility from the place that I'm working at.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's exactly what I was about to say in terms of it being dictated to you. That's a red flag. If they're turning around and saying that you have to be in, then the biggest question is why? You know, ultimately, why does someone have to be in Monday to Friday? What is it that doesn't allow them to be flexible with their time? You know, I mean, out here, for instance, you know, I'm in a brand new country. So for me, I knew I wanted to be working inside the office from Monday to Friday, because if I really want to understand the culture of the company and the region that I'm working in, it's the best way. You know, let's really get as hands-on as we can, you know, see a lot of face-to-face with the people that I'm working with. Um, it's only this week, to be honest with you, that Friday is in today. I've literally worked from home, but I really feel more productive working from the office. The only reason why really is because I've literally my equipment there, my big screen, these kind of things, they help with the actual work that I'm doing. But I feel like if companies do really want to make sure they can give a hybrid model, really make your office a really comfortable working environment so that they can literally spend hours and hours in there as much as they want, not turn up and maybe not like the working environment. And as soon as 5 o'clock hits, they want to go home. Sorry. Thank you. I was holding it in for like 10 seconds before I so yeah, it's really that, you know, and some companies have done it really good in terms of like you go into some offices and it's really chilled out. They've got a lot of like snacks and sort of drinks available. The environment there is very chilled out. There'll be play like music in the background. You know, these kind of things, they really help, because what you're trying to do is just emulate the most comfortable environment for them ultimately. So try and do your best job in terms of doing that.